Imagine paying thousands of dollars to treat your entire family to a luxury dinner, only to have them call security to throw you out of the very table you paid for. Not as a joke. Not as a misunderstanding. But seriously, that's exactly what happened to Lena Carter. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what makes this story even stranger is that when the security guards walked up to her chair and told her she had to leave, Lena didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even raise her voice. She said absolutely nothing. And somehow, that silence ended up exposing everything. But before we get to the moment when Lena's brother stood up and pointed at her across the dinner table, we need to go back a little. Because on the surface, this night was supposed to be a celebration. The restaurant was called La Lumiere, one of those elegant downtown places where the lighting is soft, the plates are huge, and the prices make you double-check the menu. Private dining rooms, white tablecloths, crystal glasses. The kind of place people book when they want a night to feel important. And on this particular Friday evening, a private room in the back of the restaurant had been reserved for a birthday dinner. 12 people. A long polished table. Candles flickering between glasses of red wine. At the center of it all sat the guest of honor. 82-year-old Evelyn Carter. Lena's grandmother. A small woman with silver hair, bright eyes, and a quiet smile that had somehow survived decades of family drama. Because if there was one thing everyone in the Carter family knew, it was this. Family gatherings rarely stayed peaceful for long. But Lena Carter had hoped tonight would be different. She was 29 years old, calm, soft-spoken, and the type of person who usually stayed out of arguments whenever possible. While the rest of the family tended to be loud, opinionated, and competitive, Lena had built a life far away from all of that. She worked as a product manager at a tech company. Stable job. Good salary. A quiet apartment across town. And for the most part, distance from the chaos that seemed to follow the Carter family wherever they went. But there was one person she would always show up for. Her grandmother, Evelyn. When Lena heard that the family was trying to plan something small for Evelyn's birthday, she made a decision. She would handle it herself. The reservation. The food. The cake. Everything. No drama. Just a nice dinner. So a week earlier, Lena called La Lumiere and reserved their private dining room. And on the afternoon of the dinner, around 3 o'clock, she quietly stopped by the restaurant to finalize the details. What no one else at that table knew yet was that Lena had already paid for the entire dinner hours before anyone arrived. Every entree, every bottle of wine, the private room fee, even the custom birthday cake waiting in the kitchen. Over $4,000. Paid in full. But Lena didn't tell anyone that. Not her parents. Not her sister-in-law. And definitely not her older brother Ryan. Now Ryan Carter was 34, loud, confident, and the kind of person who liked being the center of attention in every room he entered. For most of their lives, Ryan had been considered the successful one. He was charismatic. Good with people. Always talking about big deals and bigger opportunities. Meanwhile, Lena had been the quiet younger sister who kept her head down and worked behind a laptop. But in the past few years, something had changed. Ryan's real estate business had started struggling. Deals fell through. Investments went bad. And slowly, quietly, the family dynamic began shifting in ways that made Ryan uncomfortable. Because suddenly the quiet sister he used to tease was doing very well. And Ryan had started noticing. So when everyone finally gathered at La Lumiere that evening, the room looked perfect. Soft lighting. Plates of appetizers already on the table. The hum of conversation bouncing gently off the walls. At first, things seemed normal. People laughed. Wine glasses clinked. Servers moved quietly in and out of the room. Lena sat halfway down the table beside her grandmother, smiling as Evelyn admired the birthday decorations. Ryan sat across the table with his wife Ashley. Ashley Carter, 31, was the type of person who documented nearly every event in her life on social media. Before anyone even tasted the appetizers, she had already posted 3 photos. But if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed something strange. Ryan kept checking his phone, over and over again. Ashley leaned toward him several times, whispering something in his ear. Deborah Carter, Lena's mother, barely looked at Lena the entire night. And Lena herself seemed to sense the tension. But she didn't say anything. She simply smiled and kept the conversation focused on her grandmother. Because for Lena, tonight wasn't about settling old arguments. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just about giving Evelyn a nice birthday dinner. But halfway through the meal, something happened that no one expected. Ryan suddenly pushed his chair back. The sound scraped loudly across the floor. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked up. Ryan stood there for a moment, staring directly at Lena. Then he said something that made the entire table go silent. She shouldn't be here. No one laughed. No one understood. Deborah slowly nodded. The restaurant manager looked confused. And a few minutes later, 2 security guards began walking toward their table. What happened next would leave an entire room of people staring in shock. Because the woman they were about to escort out was the one who had already paid for everything. But the most unbelievable part? Ryan had absolutely no idea. And that misunderstanding was about to explode in the most public way possible. Let's pause for a second and ask the obvious question. Why would someone stand up in the middle of a family birthday dinner and demand that their own sister be removed? And even stranger, why would the sister they're accusing just sit there in silence? Because when those 2 security guards began walking toward the Carter family's table at La Lumiere, something about Lena's reaction immediately caught the manager's attention. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked calm. Almost like she already knew how this was going to end. But to understand why, we need to rewind the clock a few hours. Back to earlier that afternoon. Around 3:15 p.m. Long before the candles were lit. Long before Ryan made his scene. And long before security ever stepped into that dining room. Lena Carter walked into La Lumiere alone. The restaurant was quiet at that hour. Dinner service hadn't started yet, and most of the tables were still empty. Staff members were setting up glasses, adjusting silverware, and reviewing reservations for the evening. At the front desk stood Daniel Ruiz, the restaurant's manager. Daniel was 45 years old and had worked in hospitality for over 2 decades, which meant he had seen just about every kind of customer interaction you could imagine. Celebrations, proposals, arguments, even the occasional family meltdown. But nothing about Lena seemed like trouble when she walked in. She looked relaxed. Professional. The kind of guest restaurants like having. She introduced herself politely. Hi, I'm Lena Carter. I reserved the private dining room tonight for a birthday dinner. Daniel smiled immediately. Of course. For Evelyn Carter, correct? Lena nodded. Daniel walked her through the final details. 12 guests. The custom cake that had been ordered from a local bakery. A pre-selected menu so the kitchen could prepare the dishes smoothly. Everything looked ready. But then Lena did something that surprised him. She pulled out her card. I'd like to pay for everything now. Daniel paused. Most people didn't do that. Normally, large group dinners stayed open until the end of the night so guests could add drinks or extra items. So Daniel asked the standard question. Are you sure? We can leave the bill open if you'd prefer. Lena shook her head gently. No, just charge it all to me. Daniel reviewed the total estimate on the screen. Private dining room. Wine pairings. Entrees for 12. Appetizers. Desserts. The cake. Gratuity. The total came out to just over $4,000. And Lena didn't hesitate. Card inserted. Receipt signed. Dinner paid in full. But before she left, she added one small request. Something that seemed minor at the time. Could you attach a note to the bill? Daniel nodded. Of course. Lena wrote something quickly on the receipt copy, folded it, and handed it back. Daniel placed it in the reservation file without thinking much about it. At that moment, it just looked like another thoughtful gesture for a family celebration. But that note would end up becoming the most important line of the entire night. Now here's where the story takes its first strange turn. because about an hour after Lena left the restaurant, another phone call came in regarding that exact reservation. The caller introduced himself confidently. "This is Ryan Carter. I'm calling about the private dining room reservation tonight." The host at the front desk pulled up the booking. "Yes, sir, for Evelyn Carter's birthday?" "That's right." Ryan sounded casual, relaxed. But what he said next quietly shifted the entire situation. "There's been a small change," he explained. "The person who made the reservation won't actually be attending tonight." The host hesitated. "Oh, okay." Ryan continued smoothly. "So just put the reservation under my name instead." Simple request. Not unusual. Restaurants deal with changes all the time. But there was one detail Ryan didn't know. The reservation wasn't just booked under Lena's name anymore. It had already been paid. In full. And because of that, the system still listed Lena Carter as the official host. But the host on the phone didn't notice the payment line buried deeper in the file. So the note was added. "Ryan Carter, contact for the party." And with that small administrative change, Ryan believed he had just taken control of the dinner. But why would he do that? Why go out of his way to remove his own sister as the host of the event? The answer starts with something that had happened 2 weeks earlier. Something no one at that dinner table was talking about. A financial conversation that went very badly. You see, Ryan's real estate business had been struggling for months. Deals were collapsing. Investors were getting nervous. And one particular property deal was about to fall apart unless he came up with money quickly. A lot of money. $50,000. So Ryan did something he never thought he'd have to do. He called Lena. Now think about that for a second. For most of their lives, Ryan had been the older brother who teased Lena for being the quiet computer girl. But suddenly, he needed her help. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. Ryan explained the situation. He said the investment would bounce back quickly. He promised he'd repay her within months. And then he asked the question, "Can you lend me 50 grand?" On the other end of the line, Lena went quiet. Not offended. Not angry. Just thoughtful. And when she finally spoke, her voice stayed calm. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I can't." She didn't insult him. Didn't lecture him. Just said no. But for Ryan, that answer landed like a betrayal. And from that moment forward, he started telling the rest of the family a very different version of the story. One that would quietly shape how everyone walked into that restaurant that night. Because by the time the Carter family arrived for Grandma Evelyn's birthday dinner, Ryan had already convinced several people at the table that Lena had done something selfish. Something disrespectful. Something that made her undeserving of being there. And that's exactly why, halfway through the dinner, Ryan stood up, pointed across the table, and said the words that froze the entire room. She shouldn't be here. But what Ryan didn't realize yet was that his entire plan was about to collapse. Because in just a few seconds, the restaurant manager was about to look down at one small line on the bill. And that line would reveal something Ryan never saw coming. So here's the moment where everything begins to tilt. Because when Ryan Carter stood up in the middle of that private dining room and said, "She shouldn't be here," most of the people at the table thought they understood what was happening. At least, they thought they did. After all, Ryan had already planted the story earlier. According to him, Lena had tried to cancel the dinner. According to him, she didn't want to pay for it anymore. According to him, she had backed out of the celebration for their own grandmother. And if you're sitting at that table believing that version of events, Ryan's outburst suddenly makes sense. But here's the thing. That story was never true. And the only person in the room who knew that for sure was Lena. Now imagine the scene for a second. A quiet, candlelit dining room. Half-eaten plates of food. Wine glasses frozen midair. Ryan standing with his finger pointed across the table. Their mother Deborah sitting beside him with her lips pressed together, clearly backing him up. And Lena sitting calmly in her chair, hands resting near her plate. No anger. No shouting. Just quiet. The manager, Daniel Ruiz, steps forward. He keeps his voice professional. "Sir, is there a problem here?" Ryan gestures toward Lena without hesitation. "Yes." She's not part of this dinner. You could almost feel the confusion ripple across the table. Because moments earlier, everything had seemed normal. Lena had been chatting with her grandmother. The servers had just brought out the second course. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Daniel glanced briefly at Lena. She met his eyes. Still calm. Still silent. Then Daniel turned back to Ryan. Sir, the reservation is under Lena Carter's name. Ryan shakes his head immediately. No, that was earlier. I called and fixed that. He says it with the confidence of someone who believes the situation is already settled. And in Ryan's mind, it is. Because earlier that afternoon, when he called the restaurant, he thought he had taken control of the reservation. He thought Lena had been removed. He thought the dinner now belonged to him. So as far as Ryan was concerned, Lena showing up tonight was an attempt to embarrass him, to steal the spotlight, to make herself look generous in front of the family. And Ryan had decided hours ago that he wasn't going to let that happen. Across the table, Ashley leans toward Deborah and whispers something. Deborah nods slowly. Michael Carter, the father, sits stiffly in his chair saying nothing. And right at the center of the table, 82-year-old Evelyn Carter looks confused. She glances between her grandchildren. Ryan, what's going on? Ryan softens his voice slightly when speaking to his grandmother. It's nothing, Grandma. We're just fixing something. But the tension in the room is impossible to ignore now. Other diners outside the private room are beginning to glance over. Servers are hesitating near the doorway. And Daniel Ruiz realizes he needs to resolve this quickly. Because scenes like this can escalate fast. So he says something simple. Let me check the reservation details. Ryan crosses his arms. Go ahead. But Ryan isn't worried. In fact, he's almost relieved. Because in his mind, this check will prove that Lena was never supposed to be there. Across the table, Lena still hasn't said a word. And that silence is starting to make people uncomfortable. Think about it. If someone accused you of crashing your own family dinner, wouldn't you defend yourself? Wouldn't you speak up? But Lena doesn't. Instead, she simply takes a sip of water. Calm. Unbothered. Almost like she's waiting. Daniel pulls out a small tablet used for reservations. He scrolls through the booking details. Private room. Party of 12. Birthday dinner. Reservation originally created under Lena Carter. Then he sees the note from earlier. Ryan Carter, contact for party. That explains the confusion. But Daniel keeps reading. Because in restaurants like La Lumiere, there's another section attached to large reservations. The billing information. And as he scrolls down, he suddenly pauses. There it is. A payment entry. Time-stamped earlier that afternoon. 3:18 p.m. Daniel's eyebrows tighten slightly. He taps the screen to open the full invoice. Meanwhile, Ryan keeps talking. You see, Ryan says loudly to the table. This whole thing is ridiculous. Ashley nods beside him. Deborah folds her arms. Ryan continues. She tried to cancel the dinner earlier today. Then she just shows up anyway like nothing happened. A few relatives murmur quietly. And that's the story Ryan has convinced them of. That Lena tried to back out of the celebration. That she abandoned the plan. That she was pretending to be the host tonight. But here's the problem. The screen in Daniel's hand is telling a completely different story. Because the invoice clearly says something that makes his stomach tighten slightly. Paid in full. He glances up from the screen. First at Lena. Then at Ryan. Then back at the tablet. The total amount displayed is over $4,000. Every item covered. Room. Food. Wine. Cake. Gratuity. All paid hours ago. By Lena Carter. Suddenly Daniel understands exactly what kind of situation he's standing in the middle of. But the room doesn't know that yet. Ryan is still standing there confidently. Deborah is still nodding beside him. And Lena is still sitting quietly in her chair. Then Ryan says something that pushes the situation even further. Look, he tells the manager, if she's going to cause problems, just have her removed. The room goes quiet again. Because that's not a suggestion. That's a request. And Daniel now has to respond carefully. So he signals toward the hallway. Moments later, Two security guards begin walking toward the private dining room. One of them is Marcus Hill, the head of restaurant security. 6'3". Calm. Professional. Used to handling difficult situations without making them worse. As Marcus enters the room, conversations in nearby tables begin to fade. People are watching now. Ryan sits down again, satisfied. Ashley smirks slightly. Deborah looks relieved. Because in their minds, the situation is about to be solved. Security will escort Lena out. Dinner will continue. End of story. Marcus stops beside Lena's chair. His voice is respectful. Ma'am, we've been asked to escort you outside. And here's the moment everyone expects: the explosion. The argument. The protest. The explanation. But Lena doesn't do any of that. Instead, she simply looks at the manager and remains completely silent. And that silence forces Daniel to do something he probably wouldn't have done otherwise. He looks down at the invoice again, then at one specific line he hadn't noticed before. A note attached to the payment. One sentence. Just one. Daniel reads it slowly. And suddenly, the entire situation becomes much bigger than a family argument. He looks up from the screen. His eyes move directly to Ryan. And the expression on his face changes completely. Because Ryan has absolutely no idea what that note says. But in just a few seconds, everyone in that room is about to find out. And when they do, Ryan's confidence is going to disappear instantly. So let's pause for a second. Because the entire room is holding its breath. Two security guards are standing beside Lena's chair. Ryan is leaning back in his seat, arms crossed, completely certain that the situation is under control. Deborah is watching quietly, convinced that Lena is about to be escorted out. Ashley is already glancing toward her phone, almost like she's preparing to pretend none of this is happening. And at the center of the table, Grandma Evelyn looks deeply confused. But the one person who now understands exactly what's going on is the restaurant manager, Daniel Ruiz. And the reason he understands it is because of one small line on the bill. A note Lena had written hours earlier when she paid for the entire dinner. Daniel reads the sentence again silently, just to make sure he's not misunderstanding it. Then he slowly lifts his eyes from the screen. First he looks at Lena. She doesn't react. Then he looks at Ryan. Ryan notices the look immediately. And for the first time all night, Ryan's confidence wavers just slightly. Is there a problem? Ryan asks. Daniel doesn't answer right away. Instead, he takes a step closer to the table. The security guards remain beside Lena, waiting for instructions. The room has become so quiet that you can hear the faint clinking of dishes from the main dining area outside. Finally, Daniel speaks. His tone is calm, professional, but there's a subtle shift in his voice now. Sir, I just want to confirm something. Ryan shrugs. Go ahead. Daniel turns the tablet slightly so Ryan can see the screen. This dinner reservation was fully paid earlier today. Ryan frowns. For a second, he thinks he misheard. What? Daniel continues. The private room, the meals, the wine service, and the birthday cake. Everything was prepaid this afternoon. The words hang in the air. Around the table, several heads turn slowly toward Lena. Ryan stares at the screen. Then he laughs. But the laugh sounds forced. Yeah, okay, he says. We were going to handle the bill later. Daniel shakes his head slightly. No, sir. He taps the screen. The payment has already been completed. Ryan's smile tightens. So? Daniel gestures politely toward Lena. It was paid by Ms. Lena Carter. And, just like that, the entire atmosphere in the room shifts. Deborah's head turns sharply toward her daughter. Ashley's smile disappears. Michael Carter blinks in confusion. And Grandma Evelyn looks from Lena to Ryan, clearly trying to understand what's happening. Ryan stares across the table, directly at his sister. But Lena still hasn't said anything. Not a single word. Think about that for a moment. In a situation where most people would be arguing, explaining, defending themselves, Lena has remained completely silent. And that silence is now doing something powerful. It's forcing everyone else in the room to face the truth on their own. Ryan clears his throat. Well, She didn't have to do that, he mutters. But the confidence in his voice is gone now. Daniel continues carefully. There is also a note attached to the payment. Ryan freezes. A note. Daniel nods. Yes, sir. And suddenly the entire table becomes even more attentive. Because now everyone is wondering the same thing. What did Lena write? Daniel glances briefly toward Lena again, almost as if silently asking permission. She gives the smallest nod. Barely noticeable. That's enough. Daniel reads the sentence aloud. This dinner is a birthday gift for Evelyn Carter. He pauses briefly, then finishes the line. Everyone else is a guest. The silence that follows feels heavier than anything that came before. Deborah's face drains of color. Ashley looks down at the table. Michael shifts uncomfortably in his seat. But Ryan doesn't move at all. For a moment he just sits there, staring at Lena. Because in that single sentence, everything he said earlier collapses. The story he told the family. The accusation that Lena tried to cancel dinner. The idea that she didn't want to pay. Every bit of it just fell apart. Right there in front of everyone. And suddenly the presence of the two security guards becomes painfully awkward. They're standing beside the person who actually paid for the entire evening. Marcus Hill, the head of security, glances toward Daniel for direction. Daniel gives a small nod. That won't be necessary, gentlemen. Marcus immediately understands. Of course. The two guards quietly step away from the table and leave the private dining room. No one says anything. Ryan looks around the table, searching for someone to support him. But no one does. Even Deborah avoids his eyes now. Because the truth is impossible to ignore. Lena didn't crash the dinner. She didn't cancel anything. She didn't embarrass anyone. She quietly organized the entire evening. Paid for everything. And then sat silently while her own brother tried to have her thrown out. Grandma Evelyn finally breaks the silence. Her voice is gentle but firm. Lena, is that true? Lena looks at her grandmother. For the first time since the confrontation started, she finally speaks. Her voice is calm. Soft. Yes, Grandma. That's all she says. Just 2 words. No anger. No explanation. No accusation. But somehow those 2 words land harder than any argument could. Evelyn looks around the table slowly. Then back at Lena. Well, she says quietly, that was very kind of you. Ryan exhales sharply, rubbing his forehead. Ashley whispers something to him under her breath. Deborah shifts in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. The dinner that was supposed to be a celebration now feels completely different. But the night isn't over yet. Not even close. Because the cake hasn't been brought out. The rest of the guests are still sitting at the table. And Ryan still hasn't figured out how to explain what just happened. But what happens next will make the silence in that room even heavier. Because a few minutes later, Grandma Evelyn is going to do something that Ryan never expected. Something that will shift the attention of the entire table in a way he can't control. And when that moment arrives, Ryan Carter is going to realize that the worst part of the night hasn't even happened yet. Now here's the thing about silence in a room full of people. Sometimes it's louder than shouting. And after the manager read Lena's note out loud, that private dining room at La Lumiere felt heavier than it had all night. No one was talking. No one was touching their food. The plates that had been so carefully prepared by the kitchen just minutes earlier were suddenly forgotten. Because everyone at that table was replaying the same realization in their head. Lena hadn't embarrassed anyone. Ryan had. And now the entire situation was sitting there in the open, where nobody could pretend it didn't happen. Ryan shifted in his chair, rubbing his hands together. You know that moment when someone realizes they've misjudged a situation, but they don't quite know how to recover? That's exactly where Ryan was. He glanced toward his mother. Deborah avoided eye contact. He looked toward Ashley. Ashley suddenly became very interested in adjusting her napkin. Even his father, Michael, stayed quiet. No one jumped in to defend him. Across the table, Lena was still sitting calmly beside her grandmother. Not smug. Not angry. Just quiet. And strangely, that calmness seemed to make the situation even more uncomfortable for everyone else. Because think about it. What would most people do if their own brother tried to have them thrown out of a dinner they paid for? Would you argue? Would you expose them immediately? Would you demand an apology? A lot of people probably would. But Lena didn't do any of that. Instead, she reached for her glass and took another small sip of water. Like the whole situation didn't require any performance at all. And that's when Grandma Evelyn slowly pushed her chair back. The movement caught everyone's attention. At 82 years old, Evelyn Carter didn't move quickly anymore. But when she stood up at the table, the entire family instinctively looked toward her. "Hold on," she said gently. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority, the kind that comes from decades of being the quiet center of a family. She placed one hand on the table for balance. Then she looked at Lena. "You organized all of this?" Lena nodded once. "Yes, Grandma." Evelyn's eyes softened. Then she slowly turned her head toward Ryan. And for a moment, she didn't say anything. That pause felt like a spotlight, because suddenly everyone at the table understood what was happening. Ryan shifted again in his seat. "Grandma, it's not a big deal," he said quickly. "There was just some confusion earlier." But Evelyn raised one hand slightly. Not aggressively. Just enough to stop him from talking. Then she said something very simple. "Well, if there's confusion, we should clear it up. Now remember." Evelyn hadn't heard the earlier conversation Ryan had spread to the rest of the family. She hadn't heard the claim that Lena tried to cancel the dinner. She hadn't heard the story about Lena refusing to participate. All she had seen was this. Her grandson standing up in the middle of her birthday dinner, calling security, and trying to remove the person who had quietly paid for the entire evening. Evelyn looked around the table slowly. "Lena gave us a gift tonight," she said. Her voice remained calm. "But I just watched someone try to throw that gift out the door." Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there wasn't a good way to answer that. The room remained completely still. Even the servers near the doorway had paused again, unsure whether to approach. And then something unexpected happened. Evelyn reached for her wine glass. She lifted it slightly. "Well," she said, her voice warming again, "this is still my birthday dinner." A few small smiles appeared around the table. "But before we continue," Evelyn added, "I think we should thank the person who made it possible." Her eyes moved back to Lena. For the first time all night, a faint blush appeared on Lena's face. She clearly hadn't planned for this kind of attention. But Evelyn raised her glass higher. To Lena. The words were simple, but powerful. A few relatives immediately lifted their glasses too. Then another. And another. Soon most of the table followed. Except for Ryan. He sat frozen in his chair, watching the entire moment unfold. Because in the span of just a few minutes, the story he tried to create had completely collapsed. The spotlight he thought would embarrass Lena had turned directly onto him instead. Glasses clinked lightly. Someone murmured, "Happy birthday." The tension in the room began loosening just a little. But the atmosphere was still different now. Because everyone had seen what happened. And moments like that don't disappear easily. Ryan leaned back in his chair and stared down at the table. Ashley whispered something to him again, but this time he didn't respond. Across from him, Lena quietly helped Evelyn adjust her chair as the servers returned with the birthday cake. The cake was elegant. White frosting. Simple gold lettering. "Happy 82nd birthday, Evelyn." The candles were lit. The lights dimmed slightly. And for a moment, it almost felt like the evening was returning to normal. But Ryan still hadn't spoken. Not since the toast. And as the candles flickered on the cake in front of Evelyn, Ryan finally looked up at Lena again. Not angry this time. Not confident. Just pale. Because in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, one realization was settling in. He had tried to remove the only person who made the dinner possible. In front of the entire restaurant. And Lena had never even tried to defend herself. She didn't have to. The truth did it for her. Evelyn leaned forward toward the cake. "All right," she said softly. Before the candles melt completely. Everyone laughed lightly. She closed her eyes for a moment to make her wish. And as the room watched her blow out the candles, Ryan sat there realizing something that would stay with him long after that night ended. Sometimes the loudest person in the room loses the argument. And sometimes the quietest one never had to argue at all.